The lawyer hadn't even finished reading the first sentence when she cut him off. "Don't dream of touching Dad's house," she spat across the table. "It's mine." He told me it would be. The room went quiet. Her voice echoed off the paneled walls like a slap. I didn't speak. I didn't flinch. But I felt every eye turn toward me, waiting, expecting me to argue, to fight for what had been my home for 20 years. Instead, I looked down at the corner of the mahogany desk and breathed slowly, because I already knew what she didn't. The house wasn't hers, and the deed's first clause was about to prove it. "Let me know where you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel, and if this story speaks to you, share your thoughts below. Don't skip, because what happens at the end will surprise you more than the betrayal itself." The lawyer cleared his throat. "If we can continue," he said calmly. "The deed to the property located at 179 Larchmont, commonly referred to as the family estate, was amended 6 months prior to Mr. Daltrey's passing. Clause 1 states that any claim to ownership requires fulfillment of a living residency condition." I looked up then and watched her face fall. Specifically, he went on a minimum of 2 consecutive years, spent residing in the property alongside the decedent. "As you know, Ms. Daltrey, you had not lived in the home since relocating to Arizona in 2019. Her mouth opened, then closed. The silence that followed was exquisite. "Wait," she finally said. No, that's not right. Dad said I'd inherit the house." "It's what he always said." The lawyer nodded, calm as ever. "And that was his initial arrangement. But the deed was legally amended. I stayed still because I had helped write that clause. Not out of spite, but out of survival. After all, she'd stopped being part of this home long before she left it." She looked at me then like she was seeing me for the first time in years. "You manipulated him," she said. "Didn't you?" I tilted my head. "No," I said softly. "I listened to him when you wouldn't." Her face twisted. "He was sick." "Yes, and that's why he wanted clarity, so he wouldn't leave chaos behind." She stood abruptly. "This isn't over." The lawyer folded his hands. "That's your right. You can challenge it. But it's ironclad. And notarized. You signed as witness number 2, actually." She stared at him, then at me, and for the first time in our long, bitter history, she had no words. She stormed out. Silence returned. The lawyer looked at me, a trace of sympathy in his eyes. "Shall we continue?" I nodded, but my mind wasn't in the room anymore. It was drifting back to the days before the hostility, before the Cold Wars over money and memory. Back to when we were still trying to be a family. Back to the moment I first stepped into that house. It was spring, April. A light rain had just ended, and everything smelled like wet earth and lilacs. I remember standing in the front hall, breathless. I'd never lived in a house with ceilings so high, with floors that didn't creak, with windows tall enough to see the ocean blink in the distance. "You'll get used to it," Jonathan had said, smiling. "It's just wood and plaster." But I hadn't. Not completely, because it wasn't just a house. It was his history, his pride, his anchor. And she hated that I lived in it. From the start. She was 20 then, sharp, ambitious, always in a rush to correct you to take over. I tried to get close. I really did. But there was always a wall. Always something I wasn't. Not her mother. Not her blood. Not welcome. But Jonathan made it clear this was my home too. Not a waiting room, not a borrowed corner. He made space for me in every room but hers. She kept hers locked when she came back to visit. She made sure I knew my place, and for a while I accepted it, until the day Jonathan collapsed in the garden. Stroke. Sudden. He lived, but everything changed after that. And that's when she came back for the wrong reasons. Not for her father, for the estate, for the fortune, for the house. She acted like a grieving daughter, but I saw the calculations in her eyes, the questions she asked the doctors, the way she requested copies of insurance policies, the interest she suddenly had in financial statements she'd ignored for years. She didn't want to help. She wanted to inherit. And Jonathan saw it. One night after she left the hospital room, he turned to me and whispered, "I don't want her to take the house." I asked him what he meant. "She'll sell it," he said. "She'll gut it. Flip it. Take the money and run." I didn't argue, because I knew he was right. So he asked me to talk to Alan, his old estate attorney, quietly, and that's how the clause was born. The residency clause. The only thing she never saw coming. Because she was so busy chasing numbers, she forgot what the house actually meant. She forgot what it held, who it held. And when Jonathan passed peacefully with my hand in his and her voicemail going to inbox, well, the papers were already signed. Now here we were, and she was outside shouting into her phone, probably trying to find a loophole. But there wasn't one. She hadn't lived in the house, hadn't cared for it, hadn't cared for him. And the house knew that. Because some homes remember who loved them. The first time I walked into that house, I remember thinking I didn't belong. Not in a sad way, more like standing in someone else's dream, the kind of place you expect to see in glossy magazines or real estate brochures, with phrases like timeless craftsmanship and luxury heritage estate. Not a place for a middle-aged widow from a town no one remembered. But Jonathan opened the door, looked back at me with that soft smile of his and said, "This is your home now." I hadn't been called home in a long time. He had money. That was obvious. The cars, the staff, the antique wood inlaid into the staircase, everything had weight. History. But what I noticed most that first day was a picture of a young girl on the fireplace mantel. Long brown hair arms wrapped around a golden retriever missing front teeth. "This your daughter?" I asked. "Mm-hmm," he said. That was before everything got complicated. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. At the time, I didn't know how many things had already fractured between them. I thought I could help, heal, be someone steady in their storm. We were married 6 months later. He wasn't my first husband. I'd buried mine after a long, awful illness. No children. Just memories. Painful ones. I'd come out of that chapter tired, worn thin. I never thought I'd fall in love again, let alone with a man like Jonathan, gracious, fiercely intelligent, charming in a quiet, older way. And he made me feel seen, not pitied, not handled. He saw me, and I saw him. We weren't perfect. We didn't always agree. But we had the kind of bond that made silence comfortable. The kind that makes you laugh at small things in the middle of the night for no reason at all. The house was big for 2 people, but we made it warm. Sunday pancakes in the sunroom, wine by the fire on Wednesdays. I found a rhythm in it. I made it ours. At least that's what I told myself. Until Brielle came home. She didn't visit often, maybe once or twice a year. Always brief, always rushed. "Work's a mess," she'd say. "I can't stay long." She never called me by name, just her. As in, is she cooking again tonight? She moved the picture from the front hallway. Why is she touching Dad's things? I tried. I really did. I asked her to help me make dinner once. She said she didn't do domestic. I bought her favorite flowers, white calla lilies. She asked why I'd waste money on something that would die. I invited her to sit with us for a movie. She made a joke about not watching old people TV. Jonathan asked her once to be kinder. She rolled her eyes. She's not my mother, she said. No, I wasn't. But I was the woman who sat by his side every single night after his stroke. I was the one who changed the linens, fought with the insurance company, tracked every medication by time and dosage. She didn't fly in until a week after the hospital called, and even then she stayed in the guest wing like it was a hotel. She asked me why we hadn't hired a live-in nurse. I told her we couldn't find one we trusted yet. She rolled her eyes. You're letting this house swallow you, she said. And for what I said, nothing. Because arguing with her was like shouting into a well. But I wasn't blind. She walked the house like she was already measuring it, asked questions about the wine collection, asked where the key was to the back office, asked about the property line on the eastern side, whether it had been recently surveyed. Jonathan noticed, too. He grew quiet around her. One night after she'd left to meet a friend for dinner, he took my hand. I don't want her name on the deed, he said. I was startled. She's your daughter. She's my blood, he said. But she's never been my home. That broke something in me. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. We sat there for a long time, just breathing in the silence of the old house. I should have been better, he said. I let her become entitled. You loved her, I said. You still do. He nodded. But I won't let her erase you. I didn't know what he meant until 2 weeks later when he told me he'd spoken to Alan. About the deed. About the clause. About protecting the home not just from her greed, but from being gutted into something unrecognizable. He called it a promise of presence. That's what the clause required. 2 full years living in the house. Side by side with him. 2 years of meals noise compromise. 2 years of not just visiting when it was convenient. Brielle never made it past 2 weeks. And when Jonathan passed peacefully in the upstairs bedroom with the bay windows open, she was out of state again. A conference, some networking event in California. She didn't call until the next day. I'm catching a flight, she said flatly. Keep everything where it is. Don't move anything. Not how are you? Not was he in pain? Just instructions. When she arrived, she walked into the house like a realtor, measured each pause, took mental notes, told the staff she'd be making some transitions soon. She sat me down that first evening and said, I know you're grieving, but you understand this house is mine now. I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't try to defend myself. I just said, you should talk to Alan. That was the beginning. She thought she could push me out with words, but Jonathan left me something stronger. Proof that I'd loved him the way she never could. And that love was written in ink. The first time she looked at me like I was furniture, I was folding Jonathan's shirts. He'd just come back from a brief stay in rehab after his second mini-stroke, and I was sorting his laundry the way he liked it, undershirts in 3s, socks in pairs, only if they matched in thickness. Silly little systems that made him feel in control when his body was failing. She walked into the bedroom, barely glanced at me, and said, Why are you still doing that? We can hire someone. We could, I said calmly. But your father prefers I do it. She gave me a look one I hadn't seen before. Dismissive, cold, distant, as if I were just in the way. It wasn't the words that told me she was changing. It was the tone, that subtle detachment. And from that day on, it only grew. She started treating the house like it was already hers. She gave the decorator her suggestions. She called the kitchen outdated in front of Jonathan while he was sipping his tea. She walked around during his naps filming TikToks and reels of this incredible property we're about to fully reimagine. I caught one of them by accident. She hadn't tagged me, of course, but I recognized the wallpaper behind her. It was the dining room, the room I'd repapered myself during the early years of our marriage. The one Jonathan loved because it reminded him of his grandmother's house. On camera, she said, "This is going to be one of the first things to go." I didn't confront her. I didn't ask her to take it down, because I was done asking her to see me. She never would. But I was watching, taking notes in my mind. And every small insult, every offhand comment, every condescending glance became another stitch in a thread I was quietly pulling. One day I heard her talking to a lawyer on the phone. She didn't know I was in the next room. "Can the house be transferred before probate's finished?" she asked. Pause. No, she's not blood. She's just the second wife. I just need this done fast. Before she gets ideas. She was talking about me, but I didn't move, didn't interrupt. I waited until she left the house that evening, then I called Alan. "I think it's time," I said. He didn't ask questions. He never did. Brielle returned the next day and said she'd be reviewing some documents with her financial advisor, asked for the property tax statements, wanted the key to Jonathan's study. I smiled, handed her a cup of tea instead. She rolled her eyes. "You don't have to pretend this is still your house." "I'm not pretending," I said. She walked out of the room. She was in for a shock. But she didn't know that yet. And I had no intention of telling her early. Let her get comfortable. Let her preen and plan. Let her underestimate me one more time, because soon the truth would cut through her illusions like glass. And I wanted to be sitting right there quiet, composed, steady when it shattered. There was a time when I wanted her to love me. Really love me. I remember our first Christmas together before Jonathan and I were married. I made all the traditional dishes from his family's recipes. Even tracked down a rare spice his grandmother used to use in her gravy. Brielle was home from college, still bright-eyed, still willing to smile. She handed me a card that year. It said, "Thanks for making Dad happy. No hearts. No love." But it meant something to me. I kept that card in my jewelry box for 10 years. Then one day it was gone. I don't know if she took it, or if I threw it out on a tired, angry afternoon. But that version of her, that kind younger woman, had vanished long before the card did. She'd become sharper, meaner. A woman who carried her father's last name like a sword and swung it at anyone who got in her way. Jonathan noticed. He didn't talk about it often, but when he did, it was always with a heavy sadness. She thinks she has to conquer everything he said once, even me. I knew what he meant. She didn't know how to simply be loved. She had to own it, dominate it, measure it in square footage and bank accounts. So when she saw me folding laundry or making soup or combing through insurance paperwork, she didn't see love. She saw leverage, and it scared her, because deep down she knew I had something she couldn't buy. Presence, the real kind. The kind that shows up every day, not just when there's a spotlight or a lawyer involved. She hated me for that. She hated that her father trusted me, that he confided in me during his hardest moments, that he asked me to draft the final will, that I held his hand while he died. And no piece of property or legal document could undo that truth, but she was going to try. She was going to try everything she could to push me out, then dress it up as estate rebalancing, and I was going to let her keep trying because I already had what she wanted, and no tantrum, no legal threat, no bloodline would change what Jonathan had already put in motion. The house was never hers, not by law, not by love, and very soon, she would see what a woman does when she's underestimated for the last time. I stopped offering explanations, I stopped asking for basic decency, and I stopped caring whether she said thank you or looked me in the eye. That was the day I changed, not loudly, not all at once, but in that quiet, irreversible way you do when you finally accept that someone doesn't want to see you as human. I didn't fight her anymore. I watched her. She'd already decided I didn't matter, that I was just Dad's second wife, the woman who cooked, cleaned, managed meds, answered calls, the help. And the beautiful thing about being invisible is that people say things in front of you they normally wouldn't. She'd walk through the halls of this house, our house, talking to realtors, decorators, contractors, always on speakerphone. The moment it's in my name, she said once laughing, we're knocking out the back wall and putting in a pool. I was in the next room ironing sheets, listening. Another day we'll probably get 5 to 6 million in upgrades alone if we flip it within the year. She didn't even lower her voice anymore because she believed she was untouchable. That belief was the first mistake. She kept dropping hints, leaving me pamphlets for retirement communities, asking if I'd considered downsizing, suggesting I might feel more free with a change of scenery. I just nodded politely, smiled sometimes, gave non-answers like, we'll see, and that's thoughtful of you. But I knew exactly where I'd be, because I'd already made sure of it. Alan and I met 3 times in secret. The last meeting was the most important one. He'd brought the new deed fully signed, witnessed, and recorded. There it was. Clause 1. In order for the property at 179 Larchmont to be legally transferred to any individual other than the surviving spouse, the individual must have resided in said property with the decedent for a continuous period of not less than 2 years prior to his death. Failure to meet this residency condition nullifies all claims of succession related to the property. I had read it 15 times, and every time I smiled. It wasn't revenge, it was insurance. I never wanted the house because of its value. I wanted the memories, the morning sun in the kitchen, the smell of Jonathan's cologne lingering near the back stairwell, the lavender patch we planted during his first round of radiation. I didn't want to preserve a building. I wanted to protect what we built inside it. And now, I had. A week before the reading of the will, she hosted a dinner party. Her idea, of course. She said it was to honor Dad, but it wasn't about honor. It was about positioning. Guests arrived with expensive handbags and forced grief. They toasted to John with wine I knew he hated. They called the house a beautiful legacy, and she made sure to thank everyone for coming to our home. I wasn't introduced. I wasn't mentioned. I was seated at the far end of the table like a distant aunt nobody remembered inviting. She gave a speech before dessert. It started polite. Then came the pivot. I know Dad would have wanted this home to stay in the family, she said, and I intend to carry on that responsibility through updates, renovations, and continued stewardship. Stewardship, as if she'd earned the right to use that word. I watched her raise her glass. I didn't say a word, because I knew what was coming. She didn't. Not yet. The night before the reading, I slept well. She didn't. I heard her pacing the hallways at midnight, murmuring into her phone, probably finalizing the fantasy she was convinced would become reality. I made tea in the morning and laid out a notebook. Inside, I'd written 3 things: the date Jonathan and I were married, the date she officially moved out of the house, the date the amended deed was signed. All perfectly legal, all airtight, all ready. When she walked in, she smirked at my notebook. "Taking notes for your memoir." I smiled, just making sure I remember everything clearly. She rolled her eyes. "You should know," she said, "I already have the architectural plans. The kitchen wall's coming down. And we're getting rid of that hideous floral wallpaper. The wallpaper Jonathan picked out, the one that reminded him of his grandmother's cottage." I said nothing, just kept pouring my tea. She added almost casually, "Once probate's over, I'd be happy to help you find somewhere more manageable." Manageable. What she meant was smaller. What she meant was out. I nodded. "Thank you for thinking of me." And that was that, until 10 a.m. in the lawyer's office, until her name was read, and followed by a pause. Until that clause, the one she never saw coming, was read out loud, and then she blinked, then blinked again. "No," she said. "That's not possible." Alan folded his hands. "It's filed. Signed by your father. You signed as a witness." She froze. I could almost see the gears turning behind her eyes, trying to calculate, to undo, to backpedal. "But I'm his daughter," she said. "This house is mine." He said. "He changed it," I said softly. She looked at me like I was a stranger. "No," she whispered. "You did this. You tricked him." "No," I said. "I protected him, and I did. I protected his wishes, his memory, the place he loved. And when she stood furious and shaking, I stayed seated, because I didn't need to defend myself anymore. She was the one who had explaining to do, and not to me, but to every person she'd promised a piece of something that was never hers to give. When she left the lawyer's office, she didn't storm out this time. She walked. Slowly. Controlled. Like a woman trying to make sure no one saw her bleed, but I saw it. The crack in her mouth, the stiffness in her jaw, the tremble in her fingers as she reached for her sunglasses. I didn't follow her. I stayed right where I was. Alan and I went over a few more documents. Routine. Final formalities. He glanced up once and said, "You sure you're ready for what comes next?" "I've been ready," I said. Not with arrogance. With clarity, because I hadn't made these moves overnight. This had been building for years. And I had waited, patiently, quietly. Now, it was time for everything to unfold. She didn't call me for 3 days. Then came the email. Subject line, "We need to discuss what you've done." No greeting, no warmth, just the cold entitlement of someone who had been humiliated and couldn't make peace with it. I didn't reply. She sent another email the next day. Subject line, urgent. This time it had 4 attachments, PDFs of old conversations, emails from Jonathan, photos from holidays. She was trying to build a narrative, something to suggest I had manipulated him, or worse, taken advantage of him in a vulnerable state. I opened one attachment. It was a photo of us at the lake house. Jonathan was wrapped in a blanket. I was feeding him soup. She'd circled the timestamp, wrote underneath, "He couldn't even hold a spoon. How could he consent to legal changes?" I closed the file. She didn't understand how these things worked. Jonathan hadn't made the amendment when he was weak. He'd made it long before the strokes, before the memory lapses, before she began circling the estate like a vulture. She thought she was catching me in a lie, but all she was doing was confirming how far she was willing to go. And I was documenting everything. I started receiving texts from her friends next, thinly veiled messages. One said, "Hey, just heard about the house situation. Hope you're taking care of yourself." Another, "You've been through a lot. Maybe it's time to let go gracefully, let go of what the home I cared for, the man I nursed, the life I built." They didn't know the story. She had spun them her version, her victimhood, and that was fine. I didn't need to defend myself in group chats and back channels. The truth didn't need to shout. It had already been signed, sealed, and recorded, but I knew she wouldn't stop there. People like Brielle don't lose quietly. They regroup, they reframe, and they come back sharper. So I made a call to our old gardener Mitchell, to the longtime housekeeper Celia, to the hospice nurse who'd been with us during Jonathan's final weeks. I told them to expect calls, possibly from lawyers, possibly from Brielle. And then I asked them one question. "Do you remember what happened here?" Each one answered the same. "Yes, I remember everything." And I made notes, statements, timelines, receipts, because I wasn't just protecting the deed anymore. I was protecting the truth, and she wasn't prepared for that. The next knock came a week later. It was evening. The garden lights were on. The air smelled like rosemary and salt. I opened the front door and there she was, Brielle. Not in heels, not in designer sunglasses, in flats and jeans. She looked smaller. She didn't ask to come in. She just stood there and said, "We need to talk." I stepped aside. Not because I forgave her, but because I wanted to hear how far she was willing to go. She walked into the foyer, looked around, the same foyer where she used to criticize the antique chandelier, the same one where she once said, "This place could use some modern touches." She was quiet now. She sat down in the living room, didn't touch the armrests, just stared at the fireplace. Then she said, "You outplayed me." I didn't respond. "I thought you were just convenient," she continued. "I didn't think you were dangerous." That word, dangerous. I almost laughed. "You think protecting something sacred is dangerous?" I asked. "I think you played the long game." "I didn't play," I said. "I protected. There's a difference." She went quiet again. Then she whispered, "I thought I was the only one who deserved to carry his legacy." "Why?" I asked. "Because you share his name." She looked at me. "No, because I thought no one else could love him the way I did. That's the difference between you and me," I said. "You loved him as a possession. I loved him as a person." She closed her eyes, and for a moment she looked like the girl I once tried to reach, the one I baked birthday cakes for, the one I sat beside at her first heartbreak, the one I once thought would become family. Then she opened her eyes again, and the coldness was back. "I'm not giving up," she said. "I know. I'm filing for discovery. I'll have everything reviewed." I stood up, walked over to the side table, picked up the thin binder Alan had prepared for me, and placed it gently in her lap. "Everything's in here," I said. "Dates, signatures, Notarizations, witnesses, audio recordings. She stared at it, didn't touch it. "You built a case?" she whispered. "No," I said. "I built a defense." She looked at me for a long time, then stood, binder in hand. "This isn't over," she said again. I looked her in the eye. "Yes," I replied. "It is. You just haven't realized it yet." She left without another word, and this time, I didn't watch her go. I turned back to the fireplace, sat down, and let the silence wash over me. Because I'd already done what she couldn't. I'd let go of needing to win. I'd just chosen to protect. And now, she would learn what it meant to fight someone with nothing left to lose. I knew it was coming, the unraveling. Not a collapse, no. Brielle wouldn't allow that. She didn't unravel in public. She chipped privately like a porcelain vase with a hairline fracture you only noticed when the light hit just right. And the light was beginning to hit. The first crack appeared at a charity brunch. She was on the board of a local arts foundation, had been for years. Liked to be photographed with the mayor's wife, called herself a community investor. But that Sunday something changed. A reporter asked an innocent enough question during the photo line. "How are you managing the transition of your father's estate? I heard about it from Celia first." She froze, she said. Didn't smile. Just said it was being handled internally. But the question stuck. Within 2 days, there were murmurs, whispers that the estate wasn't going smoothly, that maybe things weren't as airtight as Brielle had claimed. She tried to control it, leaked a few glossy statements about collaborative planning and family unity. But it was too late. Someone had leaked the deed. Not the full document, just the clause. Clause 1. The residency condition. I knew it wasn't me. I didn't need the world to see that line, I only needed her to. But someone else had shared it. Maybe Alan's firm. Maybe a not-so-loyal advisor of hers. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Now the narrative wasn't that she'd inherited a legacy. It was that she'd tried to take what wasn't hers. The second crack came from the inside. Her fiancé, yes, the one she never introduced properly, broke things off. I heard it through one of the foundation staff members who still called me Mrs. D out of habit. He said he didn't like the way she handled her father's death, the woman said. Said it made him look at her differently. She'd moved fast after Jonathan died, too fast. Was already updating rooms, shifting money, laying groundwork for renovations before the will had even been read. To most people, it looked cold. But to someone in love with her, I imagine it looked cruel. And cruelty has a way of looking uglier when the money disappears. That breakup wasn't a scandal. It was a signal that even her circle was beginning to see who she really was when the mask slipped. Then came the legal letter, folded neatly, hand-delivered by a private courier. I already knew what it would say. Formal notice of petition for estate review and trust audit. I sat at the kitchen table and read every line twice. She wanted access to Jonathan's full financial records. All of them. She wanted to prove he'd been coerced, that his health had compromised his decisions, that I'd influenced him improperly during a vulnerable state. I closed the letter gently, made a fresh cup of tea, then called Alan. He came by the next morning. When I handed him the letter, he flipped through it quietly, nodding here and there. Then he looked up and said, "We're ready." Because this wasn't just a matter of legality anymore. It was about proof of presence. And that was my specialty. Alan had recordings, photos, video footage. dozens of emails, some from Brielle herself, acknowledging I was managing her father's care, signing off on appointments, praising how well he was doing under my attention. Every shred of that contradicted her claim of manipulation, because manipulation requires isolation, and Jonathan was never isolated from his daughter. She just stopped showing up. That wasn't on me. That was her choice. And now, it was documented. A week later, she showed up again. Not at the door, at the gate. Security camera caught her sitting in her car for 20 minutes. Engine running. Staring at the house. She didn't come in. Didn't ring the bell. Just sat there. Then backed out and drove away. That more than the lawsuit told me what I needed to know. She wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to understand how she lost, and that answer wasn't in the deed. It was in the years before, in the birthdays missed, the holidays skipped, the phone calls ignored, the way she treated me like a placeholder, not a person, and the house remembered. Houses always do. 2 days before the court date, she withdrew the petition. No explanation, no apology, just a one-line statement through her lawyer. My client has chosen to honor the terms of the estate as filed. Alan texted me the moment he saw it. It's over. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because it felt still, not triumphant, just quiet. Like something had finally settled, like the floor under my feet had stopped shifting. That night I made dinner, not takeout, not something thrown together. I made Jonathan's favorite roast chicken with thyme and lemon garlic potatoes, fresh green beans. I lit the candles we used to use on Tuesdays. I poured 1 glass of wine. Then I sat in the dining room at the head of the table, alone, and ate. Not in sadness, in gratitude, because everything I fought for wasn't about beating her. It was about honoring him and honoring myself. And now finally that was done. The house was quiet, mine, whole, and full of echoes that loved me back. When she knocked on the door again, it was raining. Not the kind of storm that rattles windows, just a slow soaking rain that makes the whole world quieter. I was in the kitchen folding dish towels when I saw her silhouette through the glass. I let the silence stretch a little longer than usual, then opened the door. She stood there, hood down, hair damp, no makeup. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped back without a word. She walked past me slowly, looking around like it was the first time. The house looked the same, but I could feel her seeing it differently. No longer hers. Never was. We sat in the living room, no tea, no pretense. She broke the silence first. "You won." I didn't answer. She looked down at her hands. "You really had all of it. Locked up. Every signature, every photo, every appointment." Still, I said nothing, because that wasn't a compliment. That was her mourning her failed conquest. She waited a beat, then asked, "Did you ever love me?" The question came out smaller than I expected. Not angry, just worn. I let the question breathe, then answered, "I tried." She nodded slowly, almost like she expected that. "But I wasn't your mother," I added. "No," she said, "but that's not why I hated you." I tilted my head. "I hated you because he let you in so easily. Because you fit into a place I thought only I belonged. And instead of letting that scare me into being better, I just got mean." I didn't reply. I'd waited years to hear something like that, but now that it had come, it didn't give me satisfaction. It just gave me peace. She kept talking. I thought I had time to fix things, thought I could charm my way back into his favor. I didn't know it would end like that. It didn't end, I said. It just changed. She looked at me sharply. "I mean the part where he died," she snapped. I didn't flinch. He died with peace, with no more pretending. "You should want that for someone you love." She leaned back into the couch, exhaling sharply, like she'd been holding that breath since the funeral. "I tried to hate you," she said. "Even after all of this. After the claws. The photos. The way you cut through my plans like I didn't matter." "You did matter," I said. She stared at me. "But not in the way you wanted," I finished. She blinked. Then tears came suddenly without warning. Big, hot, angry ones. "I wanted to be the only one he trusted," she said. "But he gave that to you." "No," I said softly. "He gave that to whoever showed up. You stopped showing up." The silence that followed was the longest we'd ever shared. Finally, she asked, "Is there any way I can fix it?" And there it was. Not the apology I'd dreamed of, but something real. I didn't lie to her. "I don't know," I said. "Some damage doesn't get repaired. It just has to be lived with." She nodded. Accepted that. "I have to go," she said after a moment. She stood, wiped her eyes. Before she left, I reached to the side table and picked up a small envelope. I held it out to her. She looked confused but took it. "It's not a check," I said. "It's not a trap." Inside was a single key. To the garden shed, I added, "There's a box inside, labeled for you." She didn't ask questions, just held it. I didn't tell her what was in the box. She'd find out herself. Photos, birthday cards, a letter from Jonathan written 5 months before he passed, a voice memo saved on a USB, his voice, telling her he loved her, that he hoped she'd come back different someday, that he hoped maybe she'd forgive herself before it was too late. I closed the door behind her and didn't watch her leave. Didn't need to, because I finally felt done. Not angry, not victorious, just done. Later that evening, I sat by the fireplace with Jonathan's old sweater draped over my shoulders. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. What needed to be said had been said, and what hadn't no longer mattered. The confrontation wasn't about a house. It never had been. It was about who we become when we're told we aren't enough. She became power-hungry. I became quiet. She reached for control. I reached for protection. And now, I had something she never took from me. My peace, my name, my place in this home. Not just legally, but emotionally. And no clause in the world could undo that. The box sat untouched for 6 days. I knew because the key I gave her had a tracker on it, one of those little tile tags people use to find their keys. I wasn't spying. I just needed to know. If she'd open it. If she'd even care enough to, on the 7th day it moved. At 6:42 p.m., the tracker pinged from the back garden. She'd let herself in through the side gate. Didn't ring the bell. Didn't knock. And that was fine. I stayed in the kitchen quietly slicing pears for a tart while she unlocked the shed. It took her over an hour. I imagined her fingers flipping through the old cards, her breath catching when she found Jonathan's writing, her hand trembling when she pressed play on the voice memo. He'd recorded it on a good day when his voice was strong. He said, "Brielle, if you're hearing this, it means you came back. That means something. I know we've had distance. I know I've made mistakes. But I want you to remember something. I never stopped loving you. Not once. Even when you shut me out. Even when I didn't know what to say anymore. I loved you. And I hope you can forgive the ways I failed you. And the ways you failed yourself." I don't know if she cried. She didn't come to the door after, but she left the key on the garden bench before slipping away. She didn't need it anymore. And neither did I. The days that followed were still, not silent. The world still moved, birds' clocks waned through the windows, but emotionally still. I wasn't bracing for the next attack. There were no more legal papers, no more veiled messages from her friends, no more noise. It was over. And in that quiet, I found the strength to breathe a little deeper. I opened windows I hadn't opened in months. I took down the blackout curtains from the guest room, her old room, and let the sun back in. I started reading again. Every day I made tea and sat in Jonathan's old chair, the leather one near the bookshelf with the small rip in the arm. He never fixed it. Said it gave the chair character. I finally understood what he meant. Some damage doesn't ruin a thing. It just proves it's lived. People started asking questions. Neighbors, a few distant family friends, even the grocery clerk who'd known Jonathan for years. So, did everything work out with the house I always gave the same answer? Yes, it stayed where it belonged. Most didn't press. The ones who did, I offered nothing more than a smile. Because the real story wasn't for gossip. It wasn't about a twist ending or a dramatic fallout. It was about a woman who was never supposed to win, and who never needed to because she didn't play the game. She simply held the line, and eventually the storm passed. One morning I received a letter. Not an email. A letter. Handwritten. Folded neatly. No return address. But I knew the handwriting. Inside it read, "I listened to the voice recording 10 times. I don't know what I expected, but not that. I thought he'd blame me, or justify what you did. But he didn't. He just forgave. And now I don't know where to put all the guilt." There was a pause in the writing. A line break. Then, "You don't have to respond. I don't expect that. I just needed you to know. I see now. What you gave. What I took. And what can't be taken anymore. No signature. Just a single pressed flower folded in the page. A lavender stem. From the garden patch Jonathan and I planted together the year after her mother died. I sat with that letter in my lap for a long time. Didn't cry. Didn't smile. Just let the ache move through me like a wave. She wasn't asking for reconciliation. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was simply admitting. She saw me now. It had taken loss, rage, war. But she saw me, and that was something. That evening I pulled down a box of old photo albums, not the digital kind, real ones. Paper pages, sticky corners, film strips curled at the edges. Jonathan had kept them all birthdays, camping trips, even a blurry shot of Brielle sitting on his shoulders at the state fair when she was maybe 5. I turned to a blank page at the end of one album, taped the lavender stem to it, and below it I wrote, "For the girl who finally came home, even if just in her heart." Then I closed the book and slid it back onto the shelf. That night, I slept with the windows open, No alarms, no locks. Because the threat was gone, and in its place, just the hum of a house that had survived heartbreak, that had survived us. I didn't see her again for almost 2 months. Life had a way of softening in her absence. The air in the house stopped feeling tense, as if even the walls were relieved to stop bracing themselves. I started sleeping through the night. Stopped jumping at the sound of a car pulling up the driveway. There was no storm brewing anymore. Just recovery. And for the first time since Jonathan passed, I stopped surviving and started living again. I painted the front door a pale green, something we'd talked about for years, but never got around to. I rearranged the books in the study the way he liked them, fiction on the left, biographies on the right. I found an old sketchbook of his in the back of the closet, watercolors of the house from different seasons. I framed the one of the back garden in spring lavender, blooming windows open. That sketch went above the fireplace, because that's what this place was now. A memory, a keepsake, a choice. Not a trophy, not a prize, and certainly not a battleground. Then one morning she appeared. Not in person, in print. I was sipping coffee in the sunroom when the local paper fell open to the society section. There she was. Brielle. Former tech consultant, shifts to wellness sector launches, grief support initiative. I blinked. There she stood, smiling calmer. Not polished to perfection, but real. The article detailed how she'd stepped down from her high-pressure firm and started a foundation in her father's name, the Daltrey Center for Navigating Loss. A place for people overwhelmed by estate planning, funeral arrangements, and the kind of grief no one prepares you for. I didn't scoff. I didn't roll my eyes. Because I understood. That's what people do after devastation. They try to build something from the rubble. Something that says, I learned. I didn't need credit. I didn't need her to mention me in interviews or stand beside her for photo ops. But the fact that she named it after him, that told me everything. She wasn't erasing his memory anymore. She was honoring it. And maybe, just maybe, trying to earn her way back into his story. A week later, I received a card. Just a simple cream envelope handwriting that had steadied since the last time. Inside 3 lines. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know I'm trying, and I hope that counts for something someday. No signature, no return address, but she didn't have to sign it. I knew, and for once I didn't read those words as manipulation or performance. I read them as what they were, an offering. Not enough to fix it, but enough to keep it from rotting further. I didn't write back. Instead, I did something quieter. I walked to the garden, picked a small sprig of rosemary, Jonathan's favorite, wrapped it in parchment, and left it on the bench outside the shed. No note, no explanation, just a message for whoever came looking. I remember, too, the house felt different now. Not empty, not haunted, settled. I started inviting people over again, old friends, a niece from my side of the family, even Celia, the housekeeper who cried when I made her buttermilk pie from scratch. This place finally feels like you, she said, and that hit me harder than I expected, because for so long it had felt like I was living inside someone else's inheritance. Now it felt like a legacy I was stewarding with care, not because I took it, but because I stayed, because I showed up, because I protected it when no one else would. One night I sat by the fireplace with the photo album in my lap, the one with the lavender stem still taped to the back page. I flipped through slowly, Jonathan laughing with flour on his nose, Brielle as a teenager sulking in a party dress, Me in the garden holding up a worm like it was a trophy. We didn't have a perfect story, but we had a story, and that mattered. Because stories don't have to be sweet to be sacred. They just have to be true. And this one, it was finally being told right. Not the way she'd planned it, but the way it really happened. I didn't know what forgiveness was supposed to feel like. I used to think it came in a single moment, a great big emotional breath like a wave that washed the pain away all at once. But that never came. What came instead was slower, smaller, like light sneaking into a room you forgot had windows. I didn't wake up one day and think I forgive her. It was more like I stopped needing her to pay, stopped replaying the worst things she said, stopped measuring how much she took, how much I gave, and how wide the gap still was. And in that stillness, something softer grew. Not forgiveness, maybe, but peace. And I had fought like hell to earn it. The house didn't feel like a war zone anymore. Rooms I used to avoid because they echoed with tension now welcomed me. I started sitting in Jonathan's study in the afternoons, where the late sun made the hardwood glow and the old leather chair groaned like it missed him. One day while dusting the bookshelf, I found a tiny envelope wedged between two books. It had my name on it, in his handwriting. Inside was a note, just 2 sentences. Thank you for loving me without conditions. I hope this house keeps you warm after I'm gone. I pressed it to my chest and sat down hard in the chair. Not because I was overcome, but because I felt held. It was like he had left me a whisper timed perfectly for when I would need it most. And I did. Because even with everything done, deeds secured, battles ended, threats withdrawn, there were days when I still questioned if I was allowed to feel safe here. That letter silenced those doubts, once and for all. In early spring, I invited a few close people over for dinner. No occasion, no drama, just food, music, laughter. A neighbor brought fresh bread. Celia brought wine. My niece brought her son, who ran through the halls like the place was a castle. And for the first time, the house felt alive again. The kind of alive that isn't loud or performative. Just easy. Joyful. At one point, I stepped out to the garden for a moment. The stars were bright that night, sharper than usual. The rosemary bush had grown twice its size. The lavender was coming in again. I heard the door open behind me. It wasn't who I expected. Brielle. She stood there quietly, hands in her coat pockets. I didn't flinch. Didn't rush to fill the space with noise. Your niece invited me, she said softly. I nodded. I figured. She said you might be okay with it. I am. A beat passed. You look different, I said. She shrugged, then smiled faintly. I feel different. We stood in the garden together for a while. Not talking, just breathing the same air. Eventually she spoke. I'm not trying to make this easy. I know. I just want to stop making it harder. That would be a start. She turned to me. I've been going to therapy, she said. At the center, the one I started. I raised an eyebrow. Taking your own medicine? Something like that. She looked down at the rosemary. I didn't know what I was doing, she said, when I tried to rip everything away from you. You were scared, I said. And angry, she admitted. And arrogant, I added, not unkindly. She winced but nodded. I thought if I could control what was left of him, I wouldn't have to face how much I'd already lost. I let that sit, then asked, and now? She exhaled. Now I'm just trying to live with the grief, not weaponize it. I didn't have a reply. Didn't need one. Some moments don't ask for anything. Not a hug. Not a reconciliation. Just a mutual understanding that pain shaped us both, and maybe now. It didn't have to define us anymore. She didn't stay late, just long enough to say goodbye to the guests and help stack a few plates. No announcements, no grand gestures. Before leaving, she paused at the front door, then said, "If there's ever something you need, and I can help, I'll be there." I believed her, not because she said it with confidence, but because she said it with sincerity. And sincerity had been rare once. Now, it was starting to show its face again. Later that night, I curled up in bed with a novel I'd been trying to finish for weeks. The house was quiet, the air cool. I glanced around my room, the same one where Jonathan once leaned over with his robe untied and asked me to marry him without a ring, without a plan, just raw hope. Everything in this house had meaning now, not because of its price, but because of its memory. And that memory wasn't tied to one person, or even one relationship. It was layered, complicated, real. And that I'd come to realize was the true inheritance. Not the house, but the legacy. One I was finally ready to live inside of fully, and without apology. It started small. A card on the porch, then a homemade pie, then a phone call from a mutual friend. She told me about the letter from Jonathan, they said. That must have meant everything. It did, but not in the way they meant. It wasn't the words. It was the timing. He wrote it knowing it might be found long after the dust settled, knowing I'd need something quiet to hold on to once the noise was gone. Brielle and I weren't friends now. We weren't suddenly a healed family. But we weren't enemies either. And that was a miracle in its own right. One morning she called. Her voice was hesitant but clear. "Do you have time this weekend? For what?" "There's someone I'd like you to meet." There was a pause. Then she said, "My son." I blinked. "I didn't know." "I didn't tell many people," she said. "He's a year old. His name is Jonah." I sat with that for a moment. "Okay," I said. "I'd like that." They came on Saturday. No fanfare, no fancy car. Just Brielle in jeans and a soft blue sweater holding a little boy with the darkest eyes I'd seen in a while. He had Jonathan's eyebrows, that soft, thick arch that made him look both curious and skeptical at the same time. When she placed Jonah on the floor with a few toys, he crawled straight for the bookcase, pulled down an old hardcover, laughed when it fell open in front of him. Jonathan would have loved that. "Is he—" I started to ask. "No," she answered quickly. "Not married. Not with his father. It's just us." I nodded. There was no judgment in her voice. Just a new kind of steadiness I hadn't seen before. Motherhood had changed her. Not fixed her, but softened her. She asked to walk through the garden, so we did. Jonah asleep in the carrier against her chest, breathing softly. We passed the lavender patch, the rosemary, the garden bench. She paused in front of the bench and looked down. The day I took that key, she said, I told myself I'd find a way to win, whatever it took. I didn't speak. She reached down, touched the stone at the foot of the bench. A small plaque I had added recently. Let what was heavy be remembered, but not relived. "I think I'm done trying to win," she whispered. I nodded. Good, I said. It's exhausting, isn't it? She let out a small shaky laugh. It is. We had tea after that. Sat in the sunroom, Jonah asleep beside us in a bassinet. She looked around like she was seeing the house for the first time. Not as a battleground, not as a prize, but as a place. I don't know what happens next, she said. You don't have to, I replied. Next just shows up whether you're ready or not. She nodded. I just want to do it better this time. I sipped my tea, watched the sunlight hit the photo frames on the wall. You start by not pretending to know everything I said. Then you keep showing up. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, do you think he'd be proud of me now? I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I saw her not as a threat, not as someone broken, not even as Jonathan's daughter, just as herself. Raw, hopeful, learning. I think I said carefully, he'd be proud that you're finally listening, even if it came late. She swallowed hard. I still miss him. Me too. And there it was again. The one thing we would always share. The one thread tying us together whether we liked it or not. We both lost the same man, and we both loved him differently, painfully, completely. When she left that day, she didn't take anything, didn't ask for anything, just hugged me gently. Thank you for letting me come back, she said. I didn't let you, I said. You just came different. She nodded, and I could tell she understood what I meant. I watched her walk down the steps, Jonah in her arms, then disappear through the gate. The wind rustled through the garden. The lavender bent in the breeze, and inside me, something finally settled. Not because everything was fixed, not because all was forgiven, but because I finally felt what I hadn't felt in a long time. The house was safe now, not just legally, emotionally, spiritually, protected, not by signatures, but by truth, by time, by transformation. And no one could take that from me, ever again. I never imagined I'd be sitting in this house with her again, her, me, and a child who knew nothing of what came before. But here we were, a strange kind of circle forming. We weren't family in the traditional sense, not mother and daughter, not even friends, but something new had started to form, a slow, careful respect, built not on blood or obligation, but on choices. She kept visiting, not every week, not like clockwork, but enough that I began to expect her and, more importantly, to not fear it. Each time she came, she brought something. A book Jonah liked, a new recipe she was trying, once a photo of her and Jonathan from her graduation, one I'd never seen. He was young, beaming, proud. She looked so much like him then. The same jawline, same eyes that couldn't hide a single thing. You should keep it, she said. He was proud of you too. I framed it and placed it on the side table beside his chair, not because I wanted to rewrite our history, but because it was part of the story, the good, the hard, the before and after. All of it belonged here now. I started writing letters. Not to her, not to Jonathan, to myself. I wrote them in the mornings right after my tea before the noise of the world came in. Letters like, you were not weak for staying silent. You were strategic. You didn't need to be loud to be powerful. You protected something sacred. That's more than most ever do. I tucked them into a wooden box in the study. One letter each week. Maybe someday someone will read them. Maybe not. Maybe they're only for me to remind me that I didn't just survive betrayal. I outlived it without becoming like them. One afternoon in May, Brielle showed up with Jonah in her arms and a small suitcase in her trunk. There was a gas leak in the building, she said. They told me to evacuate for 2 nights. She looked embarrassed. I wouldn't ask if... Come in, I said before she finished. She blinked. You're sure? I nodded. He already loves the lavender, I said, glancing at Jonah. That night she slept in her old room, the one I'd recently repainted a soft gray. Jonah slept in the room across the hall in a bassinet she brought in from her car. It was quiet, domestic, comfortable in a way that once felt impossible. I made oatmeal in the morning, the kind Jonathan used to love with brown sugar and butter. She took one bite, then another. This tastes like childhood, she said, surprised. His childhood, I corrected. She laughed. And it wasn't strained, it was real. That evening we sat on the porch after Jonah had gone down. No wine, just tea and the sound of spring insects humming. She turned toward me. I think I'm going to sell the condo, she said. It never felt like home. I didn't ask what came next. She wasn't hinting, she was just sharing. A year ago I would have feared she meant to move back in here. Now I knew better. This house was never mine, she added. And it doesn't have to be. I nodded. But I'd like my son to know it, she said. To know where his grandfather lived. To walk the garden paths. To sit at that piano and press all the wrong keys. I smiled. Let him. She looked down, thoughtful. I thought power came from control, she said. Turns out it comes from release. I sipped my tea. Control breaks things. Holding on too tightly always does. Why didn't you ever throw me out? She asked suddenly. When I was horrible to you. When I said those things. I set my cup down. Because Jonathan wouldn't have wanted that, I said. And because somewhere underneath all the venom I saw a girl who was hurting. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she whispered, I hated how much he loved you. I know. She met my gaze. But now, I see why he did. Before she left the next day, she stood in the foyer, suitcase in hand, and looked around again. Same chandelier. Same faded rug Jonathan refused to replace. Same wooden mirror she once called hideous and outdated. It's beautiful here, she said. Even the parts I used to hate. Funny how that happens, I said. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. No awkwardness this time. No stiff performance. Just a hug. Warm. Honest. And long overdue. Thank you, she whispered. You're welcome, I said. But what I meant was, thank you for finally seeing me. For seeing the years I stayed. The battles I didn't pick. The love I gave without guarantees. And for giving me in your own imperfect way what I never asked for, but always deserved. The last time I visited Jonathan's grave, I didn't cry. I brought fresh lavender trimmed from the patch near the porch, tied it in twine like I always did. I brushed a few leaves away from the plaque, then sat on the bench nearby, the one with his favorite view of the hills. And I just sat there, not broken, not angry, just settled. I told him what he'd missed. That the house was still standing, that the roses finally bloomed after that long frost, that Brielle's son had taken his first steps 2 weeks ago, wobbly, wide-legged, straight into the pantry like he was on a mission. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told him how much I missed him in the quiet hours, how I still paused at the sound of a cough, expecting it to be his. I told him the truth that healing had taken time, and that not all wounds left without a scar. But I also told him something else, that I'd found peace, and that somehow, impossibly, Brielle and I had begun writing a new chapter on the ashes of the old one. 3 months later, she moved 5 blocks away, into a small yellow house with ivy along the side and enough space for Jonah to run wild. She didn't ask me to help pack, but she did ask me to come bless the house the way Jonathan used to. So I did, with rosemary by the door and lavender by the windows. We walked through each room, and I said something kind in each one. Not a prayer, not a ritual, just a whisper of hope. Let this room be full of rest. Let this room be loud with laughter. Let this room forgive. I stayed for dinner that night. She made pasta. Jonah smeared sauce across the tray of his high chair and giggled with a mouthful of noodles. There was no heavy talk, no tension, just the hum of a house learning how to hold new love. As I was leaving, she stopped me at the door. "There's one more thing," she said. "I wanted to give you this." She handed me a small envelope. Inside was a notarized document. A trust fund, modest but intentional. For repairs, she said. Or emergencies. Or whatever comes next. I looked at her stunned. "It's not repayment," she added quickly. "I know I can't repay you." "It's not necessary," I said. I know she said. "That's why it matters." We stood there for a longing, flung beat just looking at each other. And in that moment, I saw her not as Jonathan's daughter, not as my old antagonist, but as a woman. Flawed, changed, trying, and maybe finally whole. Now, when I walk through my house, it feels like a living memory, not a battleground. The echoes are gentle now, laughter from the past, footsteps from the present, and a quiet sense that I am exactly where I was meant to be. Sometimes I still wake up expecting the worst. An envelope on the porch, a knock at the door, but it doesn't come. Because the war is over, and not just because I won. Because I chose something greater. I chose to protect instead of punish, to stand quietly while the storm raged and wait it out with dignity. I chose to hold my truth like a torch instead of a sword. And in the end, it lit the way forward, not just for me, but for her too. I'll leave you with this. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a woman sitting silently at the edge of a lawyer's office. Sometimes it's a name at the top of a deed. Sometimes it's the one who stays when everyone else flees. I was never the villain she made me out to be, and I was never the victim either. I was the witness, the keeper, the one who didn't need to be chosen because I chose myself. And when the dust settled, I was still standing in this house with my story, with my peace.